Hello and welcome to another lap guide for the iRacing Camel GT series. This week we're at Twin Ring Motegi. Here's a lap first. All right, so lap time there's a 140.219. Let's go ahead and go back to the start of the lap and go through this in more detail turn by turn. So a couple of quick notes before we do that. Weather, afternoon weather. So this is default afternoon weather that I used for the guide, which I always do. And one quick note on that is that I recommend doing some testing in weather that's kind of on the hotter end. It's always easier, I think, to make an adjustment to the cooler weather. And I didn't reset. Sometimes what I do is actually save out backups of my lap file so that I can go back and see what the optimals were for that weather. I didn't do that this time. I don't know if this is helpful or not. This is actually the optimal for like what is it? 78 Fahrenheit, I think it was track temp. Yeah, I think it was 78. So you can see, I guess what's kind of cool about that is you can see the difference in lap time from the variance in the weather, and you have a very high variance in the afternoon, obviously, and so basically about a 3.5 seconds probably total in the lap time between the warmer weather and the cooler weather, just as far as qualifying laps go. So there's going to be adjustments, and some of the things I think that are helpful to note in the lap guide are things that are relative to the way that the car handles in the different weather. And so I think that there are some things that you may not notice or encounter if you haven't practiced in the warmer weather. So again, that's why I recommend practicing in the warmer weather so that you can get an idea for what the car is going to do coming off some of the corners that might actually come off unexpectedly if you haven't had a chance to practice in it. So if you do have limited practice time, try to practice in warmer weather if you can. In cooler weather, it will really mostly be about finding out how much additional grip and how much further you can push the car to its limits to get the extra speed out of it. But at least to me, I think it's easier to make that adjustment in that order if you potentially can do that. And the weather could even be a little bit warmer than this. This is just again the default afternoon weather, and I think you can get up over 80s, 90s, and so probably track temp another 10, 15 degrees higher than this potentially. So it's a track that, because it's flat, a lot of the corners don't have a lot of camber in the road to them. The car can really kind of come out on you. It can be pretty slippery. So I'll try to mention what I do to kind of to try to compensate for that. What I've done in the setup is I've actually taken some camber out. Tire pressures are probably just a little lower than what I normally would do. Trying to conserve tires. One thing you have to do in the hotter weather is to try to not overwork the tires, because you'll definitely notice it on the following corners if you've overworked it. And while you can get away with pushing it a little bit too much on the initial laps, I think you'll actually find that that's going to adversely affect your pace later if you've overworked the tires. And that even applies in qualifying. I actually find that on the second lap of qualifying, that I find it difficult to run a second lap that's as quick as my first qualifying lap in the hotter weather, because by that point I've probably overworked the tires just a little bit more, and trying to find the right balance there is pretty difficult when it's hot. But in a race, especially, I've got brake bias moved back a bit again to kind of help shift the work to the rear tires a little bit to help conserve the fronts a little bit. You want to be careful about locking up. I had a few brief lockups in this lap, but locking up obviously is going to spike your tire temperatures a bit, and you'll probably immediately notice the reduction in grip levels for at least the next few corners until kind of they settle back down a little bit. And in a race, obviously, you want to make sure that the car's performing well all the way to the end. And so just kind of finding the rhythm and the pace that you can run without overworking and locking up and having the car slide out on you a little bit. So into turn one, the turn one is pretty tricky, and I want to talk a lot about turn one because, and hopefully this doesn't turn out to be one of my longer guys because I've already been pretty chatty, but into turn one is pretty tough. It's really turn one and turn two that you're taking together, and you want to keep the car relatively close to both apexes. I found that I actually experimented with a line a little bit through here, and the line that I'm going to show you here I think is pretty consistent and also pretty quick, where if I don't let the car run out too wide, if you run out too wide and you find yourself turning out a little bit further here, again, you'll start to notice traction loss issues. So I think that tends to happen if you're carrying too much speed into the corner. So if you're not carrying too much speed in, then you can get kind of nice and close to the curbing here without running too wide. And actually, you'll find that you'll be able to adjust for how much speed you're either carrying, whether you're a little over or you're a little less, as long as you're making sure to hit this first mark. And then letting the car kind of come out and then back into your second apex of turn two. That's really the line you're looking for. But you're also looking for an early throttle off of turn two. And so you'll notice that I'm getting the throttle here already. So that's about the throttle point. And then you want to straighten out your exit, unwind your steering, and let the car run all the way out wide to the curbing here. And you'll actually notice on the exit of the corner that the car still comes a little bit loose, and you'll see a little correction of the wheel right there as it still comes loose. And that actually happens several places in this hotter weather. It's more likely to happen where you're coming off the corner, you're getting the power down, and then the car still wants to kind of oversteer a little bit on the exit of the corner. And I felt like reducing the cambers helped a little bit with that, but still some of that is going to rely on your technique in the driving to kind of help minimize that. And again, just being very careful putting the power down. A lot of these corners are lower speed corners, and so because they're lower speed corners, you don't have as much downforce to help you out. And so when you're coming off of all of these little lower speed corners, there's a 180-degree corner, there's a there's one that's probably at least 120-degree. Turn 5 is probably at least, I didn't look it up exactly, but it's probably like 110, 120-degree corner. And turn 3 is a 90. So there's a lot of slower hard angle corners, and a lot of them are also, like I say, kind of flat where you don't have the camber in the road to help you out, and the car's going to slide out on you. So anyway, let's talk about braking points here. Braking into turn 1 between the 50 and the 100, and I'll come up onto the curbing just a bit to kind of help open up my angle into the entry there. You're looking at about a 70 to 80% brake, and you'll notice when I'm braking, and I think I was doing this because of the hotter weather where it's a little easier to lock up, I'm coming off the brakes pretty quickly after I reach that threshold, maybe a little quicker than I usually do. So I'll hit that and then start to let off, do a little bit of modulation as I'm getting a feel for how much I can brake without and listening to the tires, and trying not to lock them up. And then coming in down into third gear, you'll see I'm just kind of trailing into the corner and just very light on the brakes to help continually slow the car, but also help to rotate a little bit. And then down into second gear, and then back to throttle. at that point right here. And then of course coming off the corner, keeping it close to this curve as you can so that you can straighten it out sooner. You'll see that throttle right around 50, 60 and then straightening out. And then probably what happened here was I committed back to full throttle pretty quickly while I was still turning. And I think that's part of what led to the slight oversteer where I had to correct out of that. But it's something that, again, you just always got to be careful and ready for as you're easing it back to full throttle. So let's play this back at full speed. All right, so turn 3. Braking point for turn 3 is going to be right between the 70 and the 100. So you want to get your threshold braking done before you get to the 70. If you kind of think about that as being in between, that's fine. I am up on the curbing here a little bit. I'd be very careful about doing that with fuel. You'll have less grip, less traction, and you might actually have the car kind of veer to the left on you a little bit as you have more grip on the left hand side. You can get away with that with qualifying fuel, I think, but this is also an area where you're only going to brake maybe about 50-60%, so it's not quite as hard. So, but I'd be very careful doing that. I think it's probably smarter and safer just to get right up close to that curbing. And I don't know that it's going to give me a whole lot of speed, although it does. I just feel like I have a better, wider entry from out here. So in qualifying, and especially as it's cooler, you can feel free to do that. Modulating brakes a bit, still hanging around kind of 50% or so, getting all the way down into second gear now, and then turning in. You want to be, by the time you've turned in, which you can see is like right at about the end of this alternate road, right at about the last cone or so is about where I started to turn in. You want to be real light on brakes, and if you find that you're heavier on brakes than this, because you've slowed the car so much, and again, it's hotter, it's flatter, there's less downforce. If you haven't slowed the car enough and you're braking harder than this, it's going to come out on you. The rear end's going to come out on you. So keep an eye on that, where you're at on the braking. If you see yourself sliding, you may not be braking hard enough or early enough. The other thing to keep an eye on is, or maybe a suggestion is to adjust your brake bias a little bit. If the brake bias where I've got it further back is just a little bit uncomfortable, just try bumping that forward a couple of clicks. Bear in mind that you may lock up the fronts a little earlier by doing that. But it may be safer. And obviously, if you can avoid spinning, that's going to save you a whole lot more time than, wherever you can find that efficient level of braking. So that's where the rearward brake bias can hurt you, is if you're turning in and you're braking still a little bit too hard. You have to think about there's more braking on the rear end of the car, and that's going to cause the rear end to come around on you, more likely to come around on you. So you're looking to hit this curbing here on the left, come up on that a bit. Try not to get on throttle while you're on the curbing quite yet. I think that can feel a little bit slippery, but just as you come off of that, getting back to throttle, and you want to let the car run all the way out to this curbing here, because you're now opening up and setting up for turn 4. So you want to come out and use that a bit. Now, you're steering the car with the throttle through turn 4, so as you're going through turn 4, the amount of throttle that you provide here is obviously going to coincide with your line, how close you can get to the curbing, and I just recommend getting as close to this curbing here on the left. Try not to use much of it. It will cause the car to slide a little bit. So try not to use much of that if you can. Just try to get as close to it as you can. And I probably came up on that just a little bit more than I would comfortably like to do. But again, the amount of throttle is going to affect whether or not you get a spin or an oversteer. And so you're really steering the car with the throttle off this corner. So keep that in mind and let the car track all the way out wide. You can come up into the dirt and grass just a bit without an off track. And so sometimes what I will do as I'm coming off this corner is, if I feel like the car's understeering on me just a little bit, rather than feeding in more steering input, I'll just go ahead and let it run out and come up over into the dirt and grass just a bit. And you can actually do that without a 1X. So I'm not sure exactly how far off you can get, but you can drop a tire right off into that just a bit. And it's pretty safe because you're straightened up by that point. So keep that in mind. So let's play these two at speed. And that is another corner there where, again, if you haven't straightened up the car and you're on full throttle a little sooner, you can spin on the exit of the corner. Turn 5. So turn 5 is this is the 120 degree or so corner. I don't know. I'm looking at the map and I haven't measured it, but that's what it looks like to me. So this is a pretty tough corner to hit well. And what I found myself often doing was just maybe carrying too much speed into it and maybe even turning in too soon. And so what I like to do is just make sure that I'm braking in a straight line, being patient on the turn in and not braking too late. Kind of things in my mind here. Braking should threshold before you get to the light or the 50. So maybe just past or at the 100 is safe. You'll see that's where my threshold is just past. So I would err on the side of caution of getting your threshold braking done closer to the 100 rather than the midpoint. Just until you feel more and more comfortable with that. But you can't get away with braking it about this late. So again, that's about an 80%. And again, I'll start to trail off, ease off on the brakes pretty quickly, avoiding a lockup. Trying to be patient on the turn in a little bit, starting to gradually come in. And as you come into this corner, again, you can come up over into the dirt and grass just a bit. But I found that if you're cutting this too aggressively, over the dirt and the grass as you're coming off the corner, you're more likely to kind of miss your line and your mark on the exit of the corner. And so I think your priority coming off of this corner should be to make sure that you can stay on throttle and continually feed in throttle without having to lift from running wide on the exit. And so what I found was that the more I focus on getting that throttle point down, and you'll see I actually throttle right at about the midpoint of the curbing here, easing in throttle right there, is that as long as I was not going over into the grass and the dirt, this is where my kind of steady turning radius is, and this is the point where I can now start to unwind it and continually feed in throttle. And by the time I come off the corner, you can see where the car is on the exit. So it's right up on the curbing there. And I just leave it, straight down the curbing. It's safe to do that. And it does kind of help open up your entry, although you don't necessarily need to come into turn 6 with this wide of an entry. The car handles it relatively easily. This is just the line I just keep it on. And again, the straighter you can run it, the more potential speed you might be able to have. So I even kind of clip off of that. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's play this back at speed real quick. And again, anytime you're using some of the curbing here, you do want to be just a little extra cautious as you reach that full throttle point. If I were to reach the full throttle point just a little earlier, just a little too soon, and as it kind of comes up into this curbing here, that actually can cause a little bit of a slip in traction. So be careful with that and try not to be a little too aggressive when you're using curbing. You just use a little extra caution with the throttle when you do that. This is all full throttle, all through turn 6, turn 7. So turn 7 and turn 8, you can actually carry a fair amount of speed into this corner. And I found myself just carrying more and more speed, and I felt like the car can handle it pretty well. And actually throw it into this corner just a little bit in this particular example, maybe a more than I typically do. Threshold is at the 50. So there's your 50 board, there's your threshold braking, and coming down into your turn-in point, which is just right at about the end of the blue and white portion of the curbing, turning in. And you can see I kind of come off the brakes abruptly and turn in at about the same time. So that leads to a little bit of a abrupt turn-in point, but it actually handles it just fine. Like I say, you can come into this corner with maybe a little more speed. I don't know if it's deceptive, but I just found that the grip levels were higher than I thought they would be, and I could carry more and more speed into this corner. Try not to use too much of this curbing, and if anything, look for a later apex off this curbing. So if you can get toward the latter part of the curbing here, then it's going to help you with turn 8. If you're running wide, yeah, apexing too soon, the car's probably going to come out a little bit too wide into this midpoint here, and you're already now transitioning from turning left, turning right, right about this point. And then you just want to kind of keep it snug and tight here to this blue and white curbing on the exit. And again, avoid letting the car run out too wide, because the exit of turn 8 will come up on you in a hurry, and it'll feel like the car's going to understeer on you at this point. And you don't want to have to lift to avoid, coming off into the grass here. So you can see I actually come all the way up and come very nearly into the grass, even though I felt like this was a pretty tidy line through here. The car tends to feel like it's understeering a bit. And again, rather than just feeding in more steering input, which is going to overwork the tires, and it's also going to lead to a potential slide as you're getting back to throttle, you really want to be able to start to open up steering while you're getting back to full throttle. And so it's important that you hit your line here accurately so that you can do that and not have to lift. Now, on a corner like this, having to lift to avoid running wide is not going to hurt you nearly as much as it would before a long straight. But the general concept is that, you're not maximizing your speed if you can't get back to full throttle. But obviously, before a long straight, it would be even more of an issue. Your braking point comes up very quickly in your next corner, turn 9, which is again another 120, 130 degree or so corner, so another tough one. But let's play this one back at speed before we go to that. So get the car over to the right as quickly as you can to set up for turn 9. Like I said, the braking point comes up pretty quickly. And so in turns 7 and 8, the more and more speed that you're finding yourself able to push through 7 and 8, the quicker you're going to feel like you're getting to your braking point. And what will often happen is if you're getting to this braking point quicker and you're carrying more speed, you're probably going to be more likely to brake too late or not brake early and not brake enough. And then coming into turn 9, it's going to be a little bit of a disaster. I think I spun in my early practice in this corner more than any other corner. And it's because, like I say, I kept pushing more and more speed through 7 and 8, and I had to keep adjusting my brake point. And so at this point now, my brake point is before, I try to threshold before the line or the 50. And so there's my threshold point right about there. That might be a little on edge as well, but that's how far I was able to push it here. So that's about a 75% or so brake, and real close to the grass. Or you want to be as close. You want to be as close to that as you can, because again, you want to open this corner up. It's very, very tight corner. As you're braking into turn 9 here, I like to focus on just getting over to the curbing and making sure that I'm not braking hard, very, very light or off braking by the time I reach that. Again, this is a point where if you're still braking and if you're carrying too much speed, so it looks like we get down to about 48, 55, and then all the way down to 48 by the time I start getting back to throttle. Yeah, 49, 48 by the time I'm back to throttle. So if you're carrying too much speed into the corner, then it slides very, very easily, or it's very flat, and it's very hot right here. And so you want to be getting back to throttle. And again, making sure that, look at the tight turning radius at this point, that as you ease into throttle, you haven't run too wide of your line here. And that now, as you feed in throttle, you're opening up steering, letting the car run all the way out to the curbing. And again, there's a correction. You'll notice I still came loose. So watch back at speed real quick. So there's still a slip there, and so it's going to happen if you're just a little too eager on throttle and there's just not enough traction left. The turbo's kicking in, you're still in just second gear on throttle there, and it's slippery, and it's just all those factors combined with the car just kind of still, the weight of the car still needs to get settled when you're getting on throttle. All those factors can just lead to that oversteer and that spin. So be very careful of that. So let's play this at speed. Let's take a look at the turbo boost here. On the left side as we come into throttle. So I'm literally reaching full throttle right at about the same time we get to max boost in this car, and you'll see, I think that combination of factors is just right about the point where it's just going to be putting a lot of power down at only about 90 miles per hour there at that point, and still, like I say, not a lot of downforce quite yet at that point, and so it's going to come loose pretty easily. All right, turn 10. So this is your 180-degree corner. So on turn 10, braking in between the 50 and the 100. So threshold right in between. So there's the threshold point, keeping it straight. What I'm looking for is a late apex. So I want to get my turning done kind of on a wide entry here, and coming in close to the curbing here, but I want to exit as close to it as I can. So very late apex, getting the car over to the curbing here and on throttle by about that midpoint. So there's your midpoint, and I've transitioned back to throttle already. Coming off the corner, and I go, of course, now because you've got that late apex and you're on throttle, you can now begin to unwind and start to aim to exit all the way to your track out on the left. And again, this is another point where, I don't know if I came loose, maybe just a bit here. You can see the wheel correction just a bit. Yeah, just a bit there. So again, this is another corner where you got to be careful of those spins. And like I say, it's interesting. You go down to the cooler weather and it's almost like a non-issue. It doesn't even enter your mind. But if all your practice was in cooler weather and then you jumped into a race and it's hot like this, you're probably going to have trouble completing the race without spinning a few times. So practice in the hot weather. Let's play this back at speed. All right, turn 11. About 100 degree corner maybe, and you're braking on a downhill. So I would be careful again about using curbing like I did here on the left. I think I actually exceeded my threshold and locked up the fronts just a bit. So you're going to be more likely to lock up by doing that. So I came off pretty quickly to try to avoid sliding much, but I did briefly lock up. The threshold point is before the 100. So the point I really should be threshold braking is probably right about here. So just before the 100 is what I would look for. If you're thresholding right at the 100, I think you could only get away with that when it's cooler. The much cooler weather, you can safely do that. But be careful if you're braking while you're up on the curbing here. Like I say, that could potentially lead to more traction issues. So just avoiding the curbing is probably safer. So braking hard, braking in a straight line, getting down into second gear again, and being patient on turn in, and aiming to use all of the blue and white curbing. Again, it's another corner where you can cross over into the grass without an off track, but there is a bit of a bump if you do that. It can delay your throttle, so try not to go across the curbing here, because as the car kind of takes a bit of a bump, then you'll have to lift, or you could risk spinning as the car, the weight transfers coming off of that bump there. So blue and white curbing's fine. Getting to throttle right here coming off. So there's the throttle point, and you can let the car track all the way out wide of the curbing here on the exit. In fact, do that. Don't try to turn away from it too soon. Even though the next corner comes up pretty quickly, you do have plenty of time to get set up for it. But yeah, let the car kind of naturally track out and get your steering opened up, because as you're still not get back to full throttle until this point, you're still turning. And so let the car track out wide so that you're turning less. Avoid, having to turn more than you have to as you're getting back to full throttle. And again, it's a point where you can spin. So let's play that through at speed. Okay, so turn 12. So for turn 12, you can get all the way over here. I never did encounter a point where I got an off track or a cut track, so I'm not sure exactly how far. I don't think I found it necessary to get over to the right any further than this, but definitely like to get over to the right and open this corner up. Carry as much speed through turn 12 as you can. You aim to kind of clip that curb there. And then your brake point here is just after you come off the curbing and as the car kind of straightens up maybe. There's nothing as far as a visual reference goes to say where to brake exactly, but just as I've come off the corner, maybe as I've started to straighten out the steering a bit, and you want to brake, make sure you are straightened up for steering. If you're still turning and braking, again, that can lead to issues in your weight transfer that could cause a spin and slow you down a bit. So braking at about 40-50% maybe in between here, and then you're going to get down into third. You can use all of the curving here. You again jump over into the dirt and grass is fine. There's no off track for it, but I don't know if it's necessarily quicker to do that. I did a lot of runs here where I was pretty aggressive across of both curbings here, but I still had runs like this one where it was just as fast as anything I had run through in this weather where I didn't have to. So you can run nice clean times just using the blue and white curving here. What else is there to say though? I think that on this particular set of corners, what I found myself maybe doing wrong where I slowed up excessively was because you're carrying a lot of speed off of turn 12. I mean, you're literally full throttle all the way through turn 12. I think that with that amount of speed, I think I was more likely to miss my mark on turn 13 here on the left. So making sure that you slow the car enough to get to the blue and white curving. You don't want to miss the blue and white curving because it's going to definitely compromise your line into turn 14. So that's probably the first thing to make sure of, is that you're kind of just very lightly braking by the time you get to turn 14 and not carrying too much speed. And then some additional braking in between 13 and 14, downshift to second, back over, making sure that you can get onto the curving here on the exit. And there's your throttle point just coming off the blue and white curving on throttle. And again, opening up, letting the car track out wide, getting back to full throttle. Again, probably just a little bit of a wiggle there. So it happens several times here. And as you're exiting this corner, I find myself using this curbing pretty frequently, almost always. So again, it's always in my mind that just being cautious as I reach that full throttle point, making sure the car feels balanced and that I'm not turning away from it to avoid getting off into the grass. Because if you have to do that, you're going to have to just delay your throttle just a bit. And of course, that's going to slow you down a little bit, but it's better to do that than to spin off into the grass. So that's, I guess, the main thing to keep in mind there. So let's play this through at speed and go back to actually turn 12 and play from here. All right, there's a lap of twin ring Motegi. Hope you found it helpful and talk to you later.